again, and welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. Well, take a look at the second topic that we're discussing now. Battle over Plains of Abraham shows Canada's small, timorous heart. Well, that's an insult, what Christy Blanchford is saying here. In fact, she starts off her article by talking about the many little events in her life that made her nauseous. And she concludes by facing up to what took place, or what is taking place as we speak, about the reenactment over the Plains of Abraham, reenacting the battle. Now that's the 250th anniversary coming up. That was supposed to be a major highlight of Quebec City. Yeah. And then you have this blogger, Patrick Bourgeois. He's a separatist blogger, but not only that, he happens to also be an editor of a sovereigntist paper. He actually decided to go ahead with a fierce campaign to put an end to that reenactment, because it's seen by some still as the day that the British gained victory over the French. That's how it's seen by many of the separatists. So he got angry about this thing, and he rallied up enough support that there were threats given that if this battle, this reenactment were to take place, that they will disturb the events of the day. So basically, we gave up. Now, do you call it being a coward, bowing to separatist extremists? Was it a good thing for Canadians to do? When you look at tradition, I mean, reenactments take place all the time in celebration of history. We see it in the States, we see it at different points here in Canada as well. But to make matters worse, the Bloc, the Parti Québécois, believe it or not, decided to disassociate themselves with this man, Patrick Bourgeois, saying that they don't want to have anything to do with him. In fact, they were in his paper before, being featured as part of his paper. They've now distanced themselves from this separatist blogger. So the question that we're engaging in is, do you really buy that it was a security issue in the best interest of everybody involved? Or was it just, we gave up to political correctness, we didn't want to offend people, we were afraid to, number one, offend people, number two, maybe even deal with the possible violence from the fallout? At what point do you stand up and say, well, this is a worthwhile battle, pardon the pun, or do you just give it up and say it's not worth it? I'm going to start with you on this one, Dr.
Well, I mean, this is too bad. I mean, it was meant to be a kind of an interesting and fun and educational event, I think. That's what these reenactors do. They do it all over the world.
And it's very popular for tourism.
It's not, as I understand it, it's not about who won the battle. It's about how was the battle fought. You know, the strategy, the tactics, and all the rest of it. And, you know, so it could have been quite an interesting event, but when you're faced with the fact, I don't know how violent it would, I don't imagine it would have become violent, but it would have been disrupted. And so the decision by the National Battlefield Commission was whether to push ahead in spite of threats to disrupt it, you know, by counter demonstrations or something like that, or whether to back down and say, well, okay, you know, this isn't very popular in Quebec. I think it's too bad, because it could have been the highlight of the Quebec summer season. You know?
Yes, and it would have been great for tourism in Quebec City.
Yeah.
How do you feel about this one, Paul?
Well, I have one painting over my desk, and it's Wolf dying on the Plains of Abraham. My son's named after him. So I have a little bit of difficulty saying too much bad about the reenactment. On the other hand, I don't think that you know, a reenactment is the thing upon which to make a big fuss. Not in favor, not the kind of thing I like to go out and see, not the kind of thing I don't like to go and see. I just have no interest in it. But I think what the government did here was said, let's not give the secessionists any fire to play with. They were looking for some opposition. They were looking for something newsworthy to report. They wanted to make it look as if big, bad old English Canada is beating up on Quebecers and Quebecois. And they wanted to make it, to rouse the passions and create opposition and create dissension. But I don't think it was right not to take the bait. I think they should have taken the bait. I think they should have proceeded nonetheless, even though this wasn't the hill to die on necessarily. I think they should have tried. They should have gone ahead with the reenactment. They should have let those paintballers or whatever come out, and they should have thrown them to the ground, thrown the cuffs on them, and thrown them in the paddy wagon. You know, in Canadian history, among prime ministers, we used to have a masculine prime minister. The last one we had was Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And the rest, as Christy Blatchford said, were bushes and insects or whatever it is. They're not mighty oaks and eagles. He was a mighty oak and eagle. He was a socialist, and I don't praise him for that. But when the murderers in Quebec were going around murdering people, trying to create distress between Quebec and the rest of Canada.
Talking about the FLQ there?
You bet, the FLQ. He stood and defended his position.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. That earned him greatness in our country.
Yeah, sure, but
standing up against the FLQ.
That was a really serious threat of violence. I mean, there was violence.
That's right.
That was a really serious situation.
Right.
This is a little different.
And he still stood up, though. As serious as it was and as violent as it was, he still stood up to the FLQ.
And he looked at
that was the right thing to do.
and that was the right thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
He not only stood up to the FLQ, he stood up to the CBC. I mean, he was surrounded by reporters who said, look at this, we've got tanks in the streets, or military vehicles in the streets. Isn't this wrong? Aren't you a dictator? Isn't this horrible? And he said, what would you have me do? Would you prefer that they just go ahead and murder people? Is that what you would prefer? And well, how far are you prepared to go, Mr. Prime Minister? Just watch me. And he did. He nailed that thing. It's over. And that is the kind of thing that was necessary only because at an earlier stage, more definite steps weren't taken. If you don't take steps when some lowly newspaper editor is threatening to paintball people at a military reenactment, he will wait for the next biggest thing. He's just won that in some ways.
That's the big question. Have we become a nation of wusses, and what's the fallout going to be? Let's go now to Les on line 5. Hi, Les. You're on the line.
Hello?
Hi, go ahead.
Yes, first of all, the gentleman that made the comment regarding the eunuchs that have been running this country was an excellent comment. First of all. Second of all, I believe based on, all of the blackmail and this business that we're talking about today that's been going on, it's time for another referendum. The only difference is this referendum should be us, English Canada, out west, everywhere, making a decision whether or not we want that parasite to remain part of Canada. I personally feel we should let them go a long time ago, let them take their portion of the deficit and the debt, let all the contracts that Canada has internationally leave them because they're made with Canada, not with a sovereign Quebec. Maybe we can sell them to France for a good case of wine and maybe a pork roast or something. I don't know.
Well, Les, you've certainly spoken your mind, and hey, we're built on a democracy. I applaud that, but I want to hear the feedback.
If I could
what you're
just
going to say
respond to that
here,
for a second.
because
I don't want to be lumped in with Les on that. I disagree with Les entirely with respect to Quebec.
The attitude toward Quebec.
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah. He spoke his mind, and we applaud him for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy that he likes that I like Pierre Elliott Trudeau's response to the FLQ, but I entirely must disagree with him with respect to the attitude toward Quebec and the idea that they're parasites. There are parasites who live in every country, who try to break up every country, but they are not the Quebec people as a whole. No. They are not the province of Quebec. They are not English-speaking Canadians. They are not the rest of Canada. There are a small handful of largely radical leftists who run little newspapers like the one in question, who are trying constantly to create a dislike among Canadians, to divide Canadians and try and turn Quebecers against the rest of Canada and the rest of Canada against Quebec. And the caller in question, I apologize, but I'm sorry, sir, you're in that camp as well.
And again,
that's
why we're here, to have that dialogue.
Yes, you're trying to aggravate tensions between Quebec and the rest of Canada. That's not appropriate. Well, okay, but we have to target the secessionists, and we should not ever be allowing them to call the shots. There's only one response to a secessionist who's willing to use violence, and that is pull them into the paddy wagon.
Yes. Well, if there was violence, that's right. Obviously, that's the right. But this is somewhat different, I think. The thing we have to bear in mind is that the defeat of Quebec, the capture of Quebec by Britain in 1759, remains a sensitive issue in Quebec. I mean, because Quebecers have been taught that their identity, has been at risk. And it ended the dream of a kind of a French empire in North America, that sort of thing. So it's been played on year after year after year. It's a sensitive issue. And so it's not just, I don't think it's just this one, this one radical blogger. I think he probably had wider sympathy in Quebec. Now, I still think it's a pity that people can't get past that. and simply recognize this reenactment for what really it was intended to be.
Exactly. There are staunch separatists, but I'm glad Les called in, and let me tell you specifically why. This is not the first time we've had a caller call in to express complete disgust because a small group of individuals have managed to accomplish something that they're basically grieving about. Yeah. We see that happening, and I'm not going to disguise it here. We see it happening with some of the Muslim persuasion, where they basically hijack the entire religion, see it as something where this is what they reflect, when they see it as a very fundamental way, trying to, if you have any knowledge about what Durban 1 was about, this was a United Nations conference, an anti-racism conference. Yeah. Durban 1 ended up being a complete fiasco. It was basically hijacked by people's their own desires to, how do I put this delicately? There's no way to put it delicately. It was a movement against Israel. Yeah. And what it was a movement to further the cause of Sharia law, of a handful, a certain type of Muslim. Yes, go ahead.
Well, it's always unpleasant and dangerous in a sense when you see extremists accomplishing a small minority accomplishing which the majority don't support.
We saw it happen in Ontario when a group of individuals tried to bring in Sharia law in Ontario. It didn't happen, and the moderate Muslims were very much responsible for that not happening.
That's right.
But more and more, we struggle as a society with special interest groups that have a lot of power in our country or in our society as a whole, managing to sway the general direction. And this is where reasonable accommodation comes in. And I've heard the kind of a passion with Les before.
It's particularly unpleasant when it's, it's a threat to disrupt something like this.
Yes.
Or even potentially cause some violence. And but the question is always, what's the best way to deal with it? Is the best way to deal with it head on and charge ahead? And nevertheless, I think because there's actually broader sympathy in Quebec for that position.
Yes, there is.
Opposed to it, and that's probably the reason why they backed down.
Yes.
The way I see the Plains of Abraham and the whole historical thing is that it's not as though the English beat the French or the French were defeated by the English. It's that England beat France. Really, it was a government, one foreign government beat another foreign government. Yeah. But the rest of us were just living here, carrying on trade, living with one another, and what the outcome was who was the head of state, and did we have the common law tradition, or we even have the civil law tradition in Quebec, so in that respect, things didn't even change that much. So really, what is it? It's a defeat perhaps of France, and maybe a victory for England, but we're not England and we're not France.
Yeah, but you bring up a very interesting point, which seems to be one of the, some will say flaws, and some will say it's a great thing of multiculturalism, where you look at the U.S. and they have a very, very strong national identity, whereas here in Canada, we remain very loyal to multiculturalism, where people come in, and it doesn't matter if it's generations ago, their loyalty, in many cases, is more toward the country of their forefathers, as opposed to the whole national identity. There are many that are asking, what's even the identity of Canadians?
I don't think that's really true. I think the Canadian identity is a lot stronger.
You think it's strong?
I think it's stronger than we think it is. Because we can't define it and wave flags the way the Americans do, doesn't mean that we don't have a good, strong, healthy national identity. I think we do.
Do you think we have a strong identity there, Paul?
I'm not sure what an identity is in terms. I think if America has an identity, it's in its political traditions.
Yeah.
And Canada doesn't have a strong political tradition.
We don't have the same kind. It's not based on the same thing.
True.
Right.
True.
And so we don't have a history of. And that's not quite true. I mean, the birth of individualism was actually in, I would say, Holland and Britain with John Locke, depending on which country he was trying to avoid at the time, or one of his fellow men, and. The idea that you have rights of life, liberty, and property is a European idea that was influencing those who went, like Thomas Jefferson, and those who formed and drafted the Declaration of Independence and the constitutional documents. So we could claim largely to have the same tradition. We have the tradition of John Locke. Our British forebears are there in Canada as well.
I'm going to have to interrupt the two of you because we must go for a break. After the break, I'm going to get straight to you on the phone line, so don't go away. Stay tuned. Hello again. Welcome back to Viewpoints on the Line. Let's go now to Gloria on line 5. Hi, Gloria. You're on the line.
Okay. I was listening to your program and about the separation from the separation from Canada and Quebec. I agree with the gentleman on the left that said people from other countries come here to change all the rules. If Canada separates from Quebec, will be no Canada whatsoever. We have to stay together to be one. So I agree with everything that he said. People who are from another country come here to make their rules. They better go back to their country and make their rules there instead of come here and try to change it. You know, because Trudeau been trying to keep Canada together for a long time. And why would somebody who come and do not know anything about Canada want to change the rule?
Mm-hmm. Gloria, thanks for calling in. This is what I hear over and over again. Right here on the line, we've covered a lot of the multicultural issues, and I've heard blame passed about immigrants coming into this country wanting to change it. It's a small number, because the vast amount of immigrants that have called into this show, at least, they don't want to change Canada. No, they don't want to see it happen. I mean, but the small number needs to be controlled.
We were talking about the difference between the identities. I mean, the Americans have a homogeneous kind of identity around politics. The Canadian tradition really is a tradition of accommodation between two different traditions, between the French and the English. And we've really kind of built on that, I think, in many ways, in what has been a very healthy way. So that there are always some people, you know, who complain, some people who are worried about new people coming in, the other people coming in, and some of the other people who want to have things their own way. But the vast majority of people, we keep, you know, adjusting slightly as the composition of the country changes. It's always been like that. And it's a very healthy thing. We've done it very well.
And traditions per se, I mean, traditions should never be, you know, what governs a country.
No.
If you have a country that simply respects every individual's life, liberty, and property, then every individual is free to either be innovative with the things they do, change the things they do, or to stay stuck in the same old ways that their grandparents did it before them. So traditions are fine if you choose to use them. They're not my idea of how to conduct my life. I look at the best way to do everything on a case-by-case basis. If technology changes, I change too. But I don't want to impose that on anybody, and you know, if you want to live in the mountains and you know, live off of wood heat and cook your own pigs, well, go right ahead instead of engaging in shopping at A&P. So, but I think it is wrong to suggest that culture, when it's, let's say, people from a culture where it's you know, from another country or what have you, comes to Canada, that we suddenly have to fund their traditions. That, in other words, tradition should be the way in which we preserve Canadian culture. I don't think Canadian traditions are what is Canadian. What's Canadian is the accommodation of everyone's freedom to do whatever traditions or non-traditions that they want to do. It's the freedom they came here for. So that although they may enjoy wearing a certain kind of clothes or eating a certain kind of food, they know that when they come here, if they choose to go to McDonald's and wear jeans, nobody's going to be sending them to jail. So that's what makes Canada great, and I think as long as we remember that, then the fact that someone comes from a dramatically different culture is zero threat to Canada.
I agree.
As long as they don't threaten our free speech, and that was a major one that came up with Ezra Levant. You know how I feel about that one.